Welcome back to the Smarter Marketer podcast, brought to you by Rocket Agency. I'm your host, James Lawrence. Welcome back to the Smarter Marketer podcast. I'm here today with Ty Heath. Ty, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
We finally pinned you down. I've been trying to get Ty on the pod for months, and with busy schedule and different days and times from America and all that fun stuff.
Here we are. We did it.
Excellent. Thank you. So by way of introduction, Ty leads global thought leadership at LinkedIn Marketing. She co-founded LinkedIn's now very famous B2B Institute. Ty, you're a board member of the American Advertising Association. I've been lucky enough to see you speak a few times now on B2B marketing. Always love the perspective that you bring. I went to Inbound last year in San Fran and Ty presented. It was an awesome session. Definitely one of the highlights, it really was, of the week. It was on B2B trends for the Contrarian marketer. So I thought it'd be awesome to it's always hard to think when there's a presentation to distill it into podcast form, but it'd be awesome to talk around that content. But before we do, I think for listeners that might be less familiar with LinkedIn's approach to content marketing and thought leadership, there is such a heavy investment in research, which I think a lot of listeners probably do know of, some don't. So why is that? Like, why doesn't LinkedIn just take a kind of product marketing approach to the way it generates a lot of its research and thought leadership?
Yeah. So first things first, thank you for having me again. So it's so good to talk to you and with everyone. LinkedIn has some really great product marketing. So let's start there. That is important. We need to have people be clear on how to get the best use of all the solutions. And that goes for any brand. But I also think it's equally important for people to understand why they're making that investment. And with things being so complex, like I think there's not a presentation we go to where someone doesn't open with, as the world evolves or as the uncertainty increases, that seems to be the common thread. We need to help people think clearly, to make better decisions, and to do so in an evidence-based world, right? And one of the things I like to think about it is it's not just that the content needs to be evidence-based and rigorous and proven. In order for it to land with people, it also needs to be accessible. And so my goal is that the thought leadership that LinkedIn produces really help people move through the world and make better choices for effective marketing, but also answer the question why and open the door to other opportunities, whether it be LinkedIn or other types of investments people could make as well.
Because it does stand out, right? Because this isn't just a few people at LinkedIn creating content that vaguely pushes people into your product, right? We're talking about partnering up with some of the leading kind of marketing researchers around the world. It'd be awesome just to talk a little bit about that, I think, because it does add so much to the, I think, credibility and veracity of what comes out of the Institute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for not thinking alone, right? Of course, we have our own insights and things, but I think it's a question or a point of iron sharpening iron, that when you are thinking with some of the best thinkers or the best institutions that you partner with, which we often do when it comes to our thought leadership, it's not just academic institutions, it's actually people, and it could very well be leading marketers that are doing great things. So we try to bring other voices in our research. We try to have sparring partners. We try to debate to get to the sharpest principle. There's a story of how the term sameness got crafted. I did not craft it. It was crafted by a guy named Brian Eno. He's a musician. He came up with this idea, sameness, which is a combination between seen and genius, if I'm getting this right. It's the collective genius of a creative society. And it's what you get when you put people in a room and they're pursuing the same goal and they're debating ideas. And that what comes out of that is a sharpening of principles based on the discussion. And that's how you arrive at a better product. You could 10x what you would do if you were just on your own. So I think that's a good principle for all of us to think about. And especially if you're doing creative work, and I'm not saying in a way that washes out the edge, because I think we have to be mindful of that, but to think about how you might curate environment or an ecosystem of thinkers that sharpens the thinking overall.
It's really cool. We were talking off air. I was prepping for the episode today, and I was going back through my notes from last year's Inbound, and then some notes popped up. I think it was from 2017 or 2018. And I've been for 5 or 6 years after that
Mm.
point. I was talking around this approach to content marketing and digital and trying to move clients away from this blog daily approach to this kind of evergreen big
Yeah.
hitters go deeper. And I hadn't
Mhm.
realized that was actually yours, Ty. I'd almost propagated it and stolen it for myself. So thank you.
Love it. That yeah. Or the reason we exist is for people to find our content, and if it's useful, we invite everyone to take a look.
I'll give you credit next time. So in terms of the presentation at Inbound, it was essentially on the topic of the contrarian B2B trends for the contrarian marketer. So I guess before we jump into the actual takeaways or kind of themes in there, like
Mhm.
how did it come to be? What was the kind of genesis of that piece?
So there were 4 of us that founded the B2B Institute, and, the lore is that we were all born from within the agency business at LinkedIn. We're all at LinkedIn at the same time, and at the time, we were getting requests from customers about where are things going? What are the trends? And I think that's a very natural question, especially at the beginning of every year. People tend to look for those types of things, and a lot of organizations will create and field, here's our take on where things are going or how you should anchor it this year. And at the time, my counterparts in the business or who were responding to this, I thought through, we could answer this in the same way as everyone else, or we could pivot and do something different because there are folks that maybe can answer this question, maybe have been doing it for a long time and doing it better. How could we do this differently? And so we thought about this idea that it's not about what's constantly changing. That's the question that a lot of marketers ask, but we think it's the wrong question. The right question is what is not changing that you can bet on for the long term? And that was the idea from which B2B Trends for the Contrarian Marketer was born. And the principle is that you find ideas that you can bet on for the long term that are both contrarian and right. So we're at the B2B Institute, we have always been obsessed with mental models. We love frameworks. We love anything that simplifies the way people think. So the contrarian matrix is the founding principle through which we identify the best ideas that we pursue as an institution. So this still holds for our thought leadership. We're looking for things that are little practice that deliver a lot of value. If you want, I can break down the contrarian matrix.
Like, yeah, I'd love to.
So if you've ever attended B2B Trends for the Contrarian Marketer, so this is like a once a year thing. We just dropped some new ones, by the way, which I can talk a little bit about. You'll hear us open by saying you can be contrarian against the crowd, consensus with the crowd, or you can be wrong or right. Now, when you're wrong, there's no value there because you're wrong. And when you're consensus and right, that's where everyone is playing. So the value gets competed away. So simply put, what you want to do is what no one else is doing and be right about it. And then you can take advantage of that opportunity. So that's the principle behind being contrarian and right and finding the ideas to bet on where you can get the most value.
That's awesome. And I do think it's the audience to this pod is largely in-house marketers, and it's so hard as an in-house marketer to know which direction to go. And you jump onto LinkedIn and your feed is filled with people spruiking AI and the end of the world and marketing's this and
Oh, right.
marketing's that. And it's like, what do you actually pin your kind of hopes on? Ray Arden Fishkin, who you probably know, like he's got a good, great quote, which is what's happening in the marketing world is probably less important than what's happening in your world, e.g. focus on your business, your goals, your targets. Like, don't obsess over you're in different directions you're going to get pulled in.
I love that principle because there's so many shiny objects and things that you could completely just keep pivoting day after day. It is very reassuring to know that there are some long-term foundational things that never change, whether they have to do with human psychology or the laws of marketing that you can bet on.
It's awesome. It's really cool. So in terms of, and I'm really excited by the idea that there's some new takeaways or research to complement the session from last year. Do we want to just jump into the first where it started last year, which had me laughing very quickly?
That's one of my favorite ones. And this one is really about how memory really works and why we need to invest in certain ways when it comes to B2B marketing. And we love pop culture. We love bringing in pop culture references. First of all, we like to have fun. Two, it really drives the point home. So I don't know if you have Bachelor Nation or Bachelorette people,
Now, there's an issue here is that you're speaking to the person who'd be least aware of what's happening on Australian TV. Then you'd probably have a better idea than I. I do believe we have it. I'm probably being shown up here to listen.
I'm pretty sure, but I can share the principle. There've been like 30 seasons of the Bachelor/Bachelorette, and I think it's picked up across multiple countries. It's a global phenomenon, but it's a crazy show. So you have 30 contestants, and then you have a bachelor or a bachelorette. And on the first day of the show, there's a competition, and the bachelor or bachelorette gets a first impression rose, and they get to hand that rose out on the first day of the competition. And this is before the bachelor has really even or bachelorette has even spoken to anyone. So this you just give this rose out. And the wild things, now here's the science part of it. The wild thing is in more than half of the seasons, the person who gets the rose makes it to the final four. And so the show looks like a competition, but because of bias and a bit of what we call availability heuristics, there's a lot that's already been decided by that principle. Availability heuristic just means that people tend to go with what's most familiar to them,
Are you
right?
guys the only people to use the term availability heuristic and The Bachelor in the same sentence?
It goes together. Whether people knew it or not, whether people knew it or not. But like B2B buying works the same way. It works the same way. So we want to be a brand that gets the first impression rose because most buyers, so 86% of buyers already start with a short list of just 3 brands. They ask themselves, "What do I already know that solves the problem I have?" And they do the search engine in their mind to figure out what the answer to that question is. And then even in high consideration B2B decisions like banking, where you put your money, 92% of those people still end up choosing one of the 3 brands from that list. And so the question to us as marketers becomes, how do we get on that day 1 list? Because if we're not there, we're probably not going to get chosen. And so that's why we invest in brand and we invest in memory generation and we invest in being recalled for specific buying situations so that we can get on that day 1 list and get the rose.
And I was so happy to see those stats at the conference because it confirms what I think a lot of in-house marketers know, right? But it's been a challenge to get good data. And there was a Harvard Business HBR article, I don't know, it was a while back now, maybe five
Mhm.
to 10 years, but it was only in SaaS and it was quite a limited study. So we used to use that term in-house marketers with this information, which is because we're a digital marketing agency, right? We do a lot of performance marketing and there's a place for that, but don't come to us saying we've got to drive sales in the next quarter in a complex B2B environment. It's too late. The work has to be done. But it's hard to arm marketers with information to then tell that story internally when you're dealing with non-marketers, right?
Yeah, and that's why we often connect this conversation to the conversation of the 95/5 rule, which is another mental model principle that talks about how B2B buying works. And in short, you have the traditional funnel, awareness, consideration, purchase. We don't think it's a particular customer or finance centric way to think about marketing. We believe people are either in market or out market for your services. If they're out market, they're not thinking about your brand. So we need a different way to have the conversation that's more customer and finance centric. So we propose the cash flow funnel, which says either you're in market or out market. In market is your current cash flow, or out market is your future cash flow. 5% of your customers are in market, 95% are out market. If you are only investing in the 5% by doing lead gen, lead capture, capturing latent demand, you're putting a cap on your growth. So the 95 is a matter of memory generation. And actually, that is another B2B trend. Actually, that was one of the first trends that we debuted in our B2B trends for the Contrarian marketer. I had a really fun shoot where I got to dress up like I was in a James Bond movie. So maybe we can share that one with folks too to help illustrate that one too.
Having those two stats, like the 86% of buyers start with a list, and then at the end of it, 92% of the time, you go with one of those on your. So if you're not on that day one list, you're not making the sale. And it's like you need to invest in those 95, and it's often more than 95%, right? In a
Yeah.
complex B2B environment. Like,
Yeah, that's the thing. The 95/5 ratio can shift depending on what's happening in the world. So, in a tight economic environment, that cash flow funnel can shift from 95/5 to 99/1, mean only 1% of your buyers are in market at that time because of the conditions that people are facing, which means that more people's buying gets pushed out in the future, which also means during that time, if you can do more to invest in brand, you can still position yourself coming out of a recession to be in a better position. And I get when budgets are tight, the last thing people tend to think of is brand. A lot of times people are like, let's cut that budget. You can double down on your creative. We say that great brands weigh in, not out. You can focus on your buying situations to be more clear on what there are. So there are ways for you to get more out of less when conditions are tighter. So in sticking with the idea of how do you get more out of less and how brands can double down, we looking at a lot of different brands, people, I think the tough thing for people is this desire to keep changing things, to keep evolving. And the challenge with that is we're forgetting how human memory works. And we're forgetting that people need to recognize you and need to recognize you for a particular situation. There's a reason why De Beers has not shifted from a diamond is forever for their core campaign. And in B2B marketing, there's a lot more that we can do to not only distinguish, but at the same ourselves from other brands, be distinctive, but at the same time, invest in the same message so that people can begin to pick it up and associate us with different entities. A part of the work we've done, we have a study called Better, Bolder Branding, and it looks at the things that we can invest in to be more distinctive, to get more out of our creativity, because that actually is the biggest lever for growth. Besides the media you deploy, you can do a lot with great creative on a small budget. And so it makes it one of the best levers, but we have to focus on being distinctive. So let me ask you this, James. When you think about B2B marketing, what color comes to mind
I
when you
think blue, Ty. I think blue.
most people would answer that question the same way.
I was going to
Maybe
be cheeky and say like
if
pink
you
or
start if
bright
you said
orange or something.
I would have been like, "Really? Really?
She's
Really?"
she's terminating the call.
You're like, "Are you sure?" Right. But no, and that's the thing. In the Better Bolder branding research, we ran a study and it showed the major cloud companies with the logos removed. And it's really funny. You cannot tell them apart. You cannot tell them apart. And we actually have a fun audience participation slide where there's all the different blues of the different brands. And then we say, guess which one is which company. And people are literally flummoxed. They're like, I don't know what's great. It's terrifying. And if there is the challenge of getting misattribution there, where people are actually, you're paying to build someone else's brand. So it's the argument for not only sticking to a message, but also then being recognizable and distinctive, and perhaps investing in some of the things that are underinvested in, like characters. That is one of the most distinctive brand assets that you can invest in. Sonic branding. A lot of people are always thinking about these things. So check out Better, Bolder Branding. And actually, we have a B2B trend called the Sea of Sameness on this very topic that
And it
talks
was,
how you distinguish yourself.
yeah, and I actually had took a photograph with one of the slides, and the numbers
Mhm.
are incredible because there's this kind of theory that if, particularly now with two screens, right, things are quite a passive watching, or you're cooking and you got something on, or you're watching the football ads come on, you then go onto your second screen. And there's a crazy attribution of if you hear a burger ad or see a burger ad,
Mhm.
think McDonald's, you hear a soda, you think Coke. So if you're not the category leader, there's a huge misattribution. And one of the
Mhm.
stats that I thought this was fascinating. It was on that sea of sameness. It's
Mhm.
basically, I don't know if you know better than I, whether it was digital or not, but your ad is seen 53% of the time. Like most ads aren't seen, but then correct brand is only attributed, was it 30%? So yeah, like 36% of the time or something like that.
Is a daunting stat to see because you're spending a ton of money on the work. And if A, if it's not grabbing attention, that's a problem. But B, if people aren't remembering you for the context you're marketing in, then I think there's a slide where we show someone throwing money into a fire.
Yeah. And I think it was like by the end of it, once you
Mhm.
get people thinking of the wrong brand, and then the
Yeah,
reality that most people don't see ads, like 19% of the time, people are
that's
correctly attributing the ad to your business, let alone whether it resonates and whether they like it. It's
and I said I'm a glass half full person. If knowing that, I'm like, okay, what can we do about this?
yeah.
In
Yeah.
B2B, I would say there's still a lot more we can do. The bar to stand out isn't actually all that high. We just have to recognize that playing it safe is actually one of the toughest places we can stand in.
And what do you do? Because Australia, like the banks actually have we have a very small concentration of banks, and they kind of do have their own little colors. Like one's kind of red and black, and one's yellow, one's blue. But in finance, everything is blue. It is
Yeah.
quite incredible. Anyone who starts up a finance business, you just go to blue. So if you're a startup, I get it. Let's go orange. Let's get really stand out. But if you're an in-house marketer in a business that you've inherited the blue, what are your practical rather than leaving, like what practical advice do you have for marketers to deal with that kind of one harm tied behind their back, but what can they do to try to stand out?
That is totally fair. But here's the thing, if you are already working in an established brand, even if your brand is blue, more than likely you've picked up equity against that and you're not going to throw that equity into the trash. The good news is that there's a constellation of distinctive brand assets that you can leverage. It's not just the color. Color is actually one of the using color alone to distinguish yourself is a terrible idea. What you wanna do is think about what's the constellation. So it's everything from the fonts, the logos, the characters, the sound, and all of those things together compounding is what builds the memory. I would advise, like, again, it's not, "We're gonna change to green because there's that fun detour. I'll tell you a quick story that some people may have heard, and it's the story of Tropicana. I don't know if in Australia the Tropicana brand exists,
It's
but
funny because we can talk about my personal orange juice journey here. I used to love it, and I used to spend more time in the States, so that was
mm,
always my go-to. I think we never used to have it. I think we may have it, but now I don't drink orange juice very often, so I'm pretty sure we have it now though, but we never used to.
so if it is there, I feel like a big orange on it, and then there's a straw stuck into the orange. And that is one of the most distinctive things they have in there. And I think there was a new brand manager one time and they said, let's change it up. They removed the orange with the straw from the carton and the sales plummeted because people could not find the brand. And so they had to pivot back. And in our experience as marketers could point to any number of different stories where someone overly ambitious came in and they were like, we're going to redefine this. And then they did. And then they ultimately ended up having to switch back.
Yeah, Mark Ritson, who's huge down here, I think he's launching kind of heavily into America now with the mini MBA, but he would talk ad nauseum, and I don't want to put words into his mouth, but essentially there's almost never a reason to do a rebrand. There's exceptions, obviously, but to kind of change your name or anything like that, so much investment takes place in memory and distinctive brand assets and whatever else. You have to go further with what you've got, not kind of jettison it all.
Stress test for a CMO. We have to think of ourselves as stewards of the brand. We're guiding it to the next stage. There's a lot of equity already built. Why would you torpedo that? So how do we steward it to the next level? How do we build on it is the thing to think about. What's the strategy there?
Thought the point you made in this session, and you touched on just very briefly before around characters, how
Yeah.
characters can really help because if you're dealing with this serious sameness, and everyone's blue, the impact when you mentioned color, kind of all of the different assets, it's important, but there's other levers that can be bigger. Could you talk a little bit about characters, both real world and otherwise? Because I think in B2B, it is often a challenge to get real people, but not always, right?
Yeah, I don't know why people tend to think of characters as maybe fluffy and maybe unserious. Perhaps that's why B2B hasn't bet as much on using characters, but I'll just reiterate they are one of the most distinctive and recognizable brand assets that you could invest in. The insurance category certainly gets that. They've got multiple characters from like Limu Emu to like all the geckos and like
Mm.
you might think to yourself, what does that have to do with insurance? It doesn't, that's not the point. The point is that you remember that association. So it's very powerful. You can create a character, but also I think your executives and the people working for you and working with you are also recognizable voices. And so people might choose to use a celebrity, but also you can invest in your own team and build someone who has shown themselves to have a strong point of view and a voice, and think about how you empower them and build them up as a representative of the brand as well. So I think that's a big opportunity, and that can often you think about the body of your employees that can expand your reach. It's actually one of the most underinvested areas.
I was going to say this conversation, right? It's going to
Right.
have other people who have previously been in the team, like it creates a connection from the brand.
Right.
And yeah, it's funny in the Australian and more on the B2C side, but yeah, we don't, in our insurance space, we don't have as many of those characters. But then I think about in our telco space, there was like a real upstart telco, and they
Mm.
just always had this kind of quirky guy who just kind of cut through, and every ad forever was him. And I suspect
Yeah.
that they've spent not, they would have spent nothing like the big telco brands, but the penetration that they've gained from that is quite incredible. So I think it is, there's something about us as humans and our ability to kind of connect into a character, right?
Absolutely. Especially in B2B, it's underutilized and it's we think about the halo of celebrity in B2C and B2B, it's a halo of credibility, but it's also fun. So I think depending on the context, you can deploy a memorable stable of distinctive brand assets, whether it's a character or it's a person
Yeah,
to convey and reach your goal.
that's right.
Trust transference that takes place when you do that is connected to the brand. And that goes into the whole creator economy conversation that which is also exploding in the B2B space too
Yeah,
right
it's really,
now.
and even more so with AI. The next one I really like because it, to me, is very contrarian, right? Partly because of evil digital marketers like me. We've pushed this narrative of hyper segmentation and all this stuff, and firmly I believe we have gone too far, right? And there was a
Oh boy.
very interesting section of your presentation around the search for similarities.
Yes, yes. This one we owe quite a debt to the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, who has done amazing work around a concept called category entry points. And it just is a great way to think again about how human memory works with brand associations. And what you're pointing to that marketers have done over time is hyper targeting, like slicing and dicing and slicing and dicing and all. Now you're down to talking to Joe in Montana, like one person, or Joe in Sydney, rather. And when you think about your marketing strategy overall, I think part of the issue with that is that you're making a lot of assumptions. And there's a principle that when you start like we all know, when you start making assumptions, you can get a lot of things wrong. And it also speaks to who you think someone is rather than the situation they find themselves in. To illustrate this point, I love sharing an example of coffee brands, but I admit I don't know the coffee brands in Australia. See, so
We're like the only market where Starbucks came and had to leave because we have a very fragmented is the right word, but it's we like to deal with little coffee shops where one person owns it.
oh,
So they're
well,
coming back. We have, I don't want to kind of boast, but we have excellent coffee. So I think it was, they came in and were like, and then they've started to come back, but in more touristy, high traffic areas, but there's only a few.
I would love to learn a little bit more about the coffee market. I'll need to come. All right, so let me share it this way. So when people think about a coffee brand in the United States, when I'm asking people, typically most people will say Starbucks is the thing that they know. The biggest brand in the category tends to be named because they meet the most buying situations. So you will think about Starbucks in a lot of different contexts, whether you're walking down the street, whether you're meeting with a friend. But as you start to identify different buying situations, other brands start to enter the conversation. So in the United States, when I say, okay, Starbucks is the top of mind brand, but what is the brand you think about when you want to meet a friend? And so now other brands start to enter the picture. Some people are like Blue Bottle or just whatever street or in their neighborhood coffee that they get joy from is top of the list for them. And you might say, which coffee brand do you think about when you're laying on your couch in a blanket on Sunday? And then it becomes, in the United States anyway, Folgers or Nescafe. And the idea is that the fact that the context changes the brands that come to mind is actually a major opportunity for marketers because we're not all going to be Starbucks when
Mm.
you launch a brand, right? But the key is to think about what is the context that I could invest in and own. And so you might say, what buying situations come up commonly enough to make this commercially viable for us? What can I credibly own as a brand that makes sense that people would associate me with? And where can I actually compete? Because do you want to go head to head with Starbucks on the buying situation that they're most resonant in? Or is there an opportunity that you can pursue? And so the combination of what we call those three C's that I just named, that becomes the strategy through which you can start to think about your marketing investment. And we like to think of category entry points as capital allocation for marketers because you can't bet on everything. You need to decide, where am I going to invest? And once you figure that out, then you can start to think about, okay, we've gotten this. How might I build from here? But the category entry points conversation is actually a great way to think about it. And that's why we talk about how search for similarities. What are the situations that people commonly, similarly find themselves in?
I can't remember the exact example, but it was a great example of you could be targeting big law firms, small law firms. And I looked at it and went, yeah, I reckon 5 years ago, if we were building a digital campaign, we would have put creative for, we would have
Mm,
treated the big firms differently to the small firms, to the specialist insurance, whatever it might be. But
yeah,
I was like, the downside of, but even from a digital buying perspective, right? Of having such granularity, you start to, the way the algorithms work these days, you're not
right.
getting as good data coming into them, which means they're not getting optimized as well. And I reckon it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, our team, because I think it's also we've lost some targeting capability, particularly in Australia compared to,
Mm,
but often the campaigns that are broader, but still well thought out do generate better results than hyper targeted.
yeah. For B2B, you want to try to reach all relevant category buyers to the extent that you can. And the better way to think about it is, what is the situation I can pursue for those buyers? And that law example, there's actually a law firm that did that ad. I cannot remember the name of them right now. They have created a character called Lady Law, which is super fun. And that character talked about various buying situations in the ad. And it was then clear what that law firm did, and people will remember that character.
Even the way we market Rocket, like we used to take a more surgical approach, and we're talking about it actually really recently. We're so happy if like marketing students pick up some of our content. We're so
Mhm.
happy that if some agency folk engaging with us, because you never know, like in 5 years' time, right, those people are back, their client side, or the students are now in roles. It's not the idea that you're only just trying to target a really specific
Oh
job
my
title.
god,
It's just, yeah.
that's the thing. Yeah, that is the thing. You just don't know who is going to be in the decision-making seat, and that even gets to one of the other trends, that I talked about at Inbound, the hidden buyers. Not only are we failing to recognize that folks that are maybe entry will be in ultimate decision-making seat someday, and they're probably doing the research and weighing in on what brand to make a deal with or what to close or what to buy. There are also other people in decision-making seats that we are not aware that we should be talking to, and that, 40% of B2B deals actually are not lost due to a competitor. They're lost due to people being too afraid too scared to make a decision so that they do absolutely nothing. And it's the job to be done, and the job that brand helps marketers do to a great degree is actually mitigate the risk that people feel by just being known in the first place. And not just known to maybe the IT decision maker if you're selling software, but to legal, procurement, and finance who are invisible essentially, but hold maybe 50% of decision making power. And then your champion comes into the room and they say, I love this brand. I want to work with this brand. And then legals, I never heard of them. Who are they? And that is not a good place to be.
It's just true, right? It's no one gets fired for hiring IBM kind of thing. But you look at the big SaaS businesses now as well, and they've really wisened up to it, right? They know that yes, you're trying to hit maybe marketers, or you might be trying to hit the senior technical people in a business, but there's a reason why they sponsor golf events and
Right.
whatever else, and airport lounges and blah blah blah. It's because they know that the person that ultimately is going to sign off on it, if they've never heard of them, coming back to that original bit of research around the decision one list, you're not going to
Exactly.
get signed off, right?
That's exactly right. It can be pretty terrifying. People think that it's just another decision, but in B2B, it's very high stakes. People can lose. You could, as you said, no one ever got fired for buying IBM, which is the key phrase, but it's a $100,000 platform. And if you make the wrong decision, wow.
I'm glad you went to the hidden buyer gap because I had that as one of the talking points. I think this is fascinating, is the circles of doom.
Yeah, circles of doom. So this is the ongoing issue of marketing that I pray we will somehow find a way through someday. And it's like the sales and marketing alignment conversation and how do we work together? LinkedIn has a unique view on this because we have the multiple lines of business. We have our marketing solutions, we have our sales solutions, we also have talent solutions as well, among other
Mm.
things. And in our own research, we were able to see the level of overlap between targeting that sales pursued through Sales Navigator and then also through marketing, through our marketing solutions. And in the research, this won't be shocking to very many people. What we saw is that there's only a really tiny sliver overlap between the two, meaning that the people that sales is trying to talk to, marketing is not really providing air cover in many cases for many businesses.
Wasn't it like 10%? The slide was like a Venn diagram kind of
Yeah.
showing the business is marketing's targeting and the business that sales is
Yeah.
targeting.
In a perfect world, there'd be like a 100% overlap between those circles, and the marketing circle would be bigger actually because we're providing air cover. The circles of doom is helping people understand why that needs to happen and how you get there. So let me just speak to the results because I think that speaks volumes to why we need to have marketing and sales working hand in hand. And there's all sorts of like cultural and other things that need to happen within the business politics to make that happen, but it's one of the best partnerships that you can make. But in the research, we looked at marketing, sales, and talent solutions. And what we found is that in all cases, brand provided a lift. So, from a marketing solution standpoint, marketing is a growth engine for the business when it creates a bigger pipeline for sales. So, that's an obvious thing. We all understand that. From a sales standpoint, when people were exposed to a warm brand message versus just cold outreach from sales alone, people were more likely to respond to that person's LinkedIn email. They were more likely to respond to a connection request. They're more likely to pick up the phone for that salesperson's call. Talent was actually one of the biggest things. And then we don't often talk about the role that marketing plays to open the door for the talent side of a business. But if you think about it, people want to work for brands they admire, recognize, and trust. It's why in people's LinkedIn profiles, you'll often see, even if they've moved on from working for a certain company, they'll say X this or X that because they still claim that brand. But
Mm.
when you expose talent to a brand versus cold outreach from a recruiter, the response rate jumps. And I think this was the biggest increase of them all. And I will always like advocate for this because I think brand does not get enough credit, or the work that marketers do generally doesn't get enough credit. it's really important for marketing stakeholders in the business and the C-suite to understand what an engine marketing is for the rest of the business. And it's intangible for a lot of people to make that connection because some of these things pay off in the long term. These are long term bets you're making that ultimately strengthens your business from a number of different standpoints. All the points I just made, it mitigates risk. It increases your pricing power. It increases your growth. And for all of those reasons, I just think there's more work to be done both for marketers to articulate that, but it's a two-way street. We need for other stakeholders in the C-suite and businesses to understand the role that marketing actually plays.
And it is why the work of LinkedIn and the B2B Institute is so powerful, right? To actually have data, because so
Mhm.
often marketers don't get taken seriously as they should. And often it is because marketers aren't as data driven. They haven't done finance degrees and whatever else. And that's often the language that the board speaks, right? So I think actually having data around the day one list and around the importance of sales and marketing alignment, data to suggest that if we have a strong brand, it's going to help our outbound sales effort. And I think the bit around recruitment is so interesting. No one ever reaches out to Rocket to say, we want to invest in marketing for recruitment. But then once you
Sure.
actually have a workshop with a client, it'll often be the second or third thing that gets raised. And then suddenly it opens up to be these huge, yeah, and talent's important. And we're happy to invest. And and to your point, maybe it's because
Wow.
marketers have raised it as big an issue as it should be, right?
Yeah, and we are trying to expand the conversation in the category. For a long time, we've been on this idea of underinvestment in brand. Lately, we've expanded into how B2B buying decisions are actually being made and looking at the buying committee and how do you reduce the friction and understand that people need defensibility ultimately to come to a decision. And so our work, I hope people tap into to take with you, to have better conversations, to have evidence-backed conversations, and to also think about how you can speak the language of your other counterparts. And again, I'm a marketer. I think that other people have to understand our language, but sometimes we have to think about like how do we position what we're doing in more financial terms. And so we do have some other content like marketing to the CFO or three financial drivers that we think are it's a fun way, hopefully, that it can tap into to think about how to tell the story that's going to resonate more with the business.
It's awesome. Ty, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We'll include links to different parts of the website to some of those resources because they are such good resources for, I think, largely for B2B marketers, but I think there's a lot of stuff in there which is just good stuff for all marketers, right? So thanks so much
Great.
for spending your time with us.
My pleasure.